So yeah, we've got a lot of ground to cover, not so much new conceptual ground, but certainly a lot of very quotable passages. So it's probably a good idea to dive right in. I'll be covering the final two chapters, Religion and Science and Requisites for Social Progress. Now, when Whitehead talks about religion and science, the first thing he brings up, and also the first thing that sort of comes to mind, is the conflict between the two spheres of human existence. And he does present this conflict as a very important one, saying that it is no exaggeration to say that the future course of history depends upon the decision of this generation as to the relations between them. But even though it is an important conflict, Whitehead stresses two key facts here. The first one being that there has always been a conflict between religion and science. That is not something uniquely modern or something completely new. The second fact is that both religion and science have always been in a state of continual development, something which is perhaps obvious with science, but maybe not so much with religion, at least not at first glance. The example he gives is that of Christian cosmology and eschatology. So, of course, in the first centuries of Christianity, the early Christians believed, at least many of them believed, that the end times were very near. And that formed a very important part of the theology of the day. But then, of course, that turned out not to be the case. And theology, eschatology, and soteriology sort of adapted accordingly. Or another example that he gives is that of the fact that people used to believe that hell was literally a place underground and that heaven was literally up there in the sky. Of course, the belief proved to be unfounded, and religion sort of adapted itself into a subtler form to accommodate this change. But one point that Whitehead makes is that it's not simply the case that science was always right and religion was always wrong in these conflicts. He says that both of them went through basically paradigm shifts. Of course, he doesn't use this expression, but seems apt to describe what he means here. The example he gives is that of Galileo and celestial bodies. So, of course, first we had the geocentric model. It was believed that the Earth was at rest and the sun was in motion. And then later, it was believed that the sun was at rest and the Earth was in motion. Later still, with the Newtonians and their idea of absolute space, came the notion that both of these celestial bodies are in motion through absolute space. Now, today, we would say that all of these statements contain some aspect of the truth. The point is, the main point is how you fix your frame of reference. And Whitehead basically says that something similar can be applied to the clash between religion and science. It's not that one has got all of the truth and the other hasn't got any of it, but rather that both express different aspects of human existence and that both can be reconciled in a deeper and subtler form. This is a quote about this, the first of quite a few. Science is concerned with the general conditions which are observed to regulate physical phenomena, whereas religion is wholly wrapped up in the contemplation of moral and aesthetic values. On the one side, there is the law of gravitation, and on the other, the contemplation of the beauty of holiness. What one side sees, the other misses, and vice versa. This is also why I find the term paradigm somewhat apt here. But in all of these clashes of doctrines between religion and science, or also within each of the separate spheres, is not to be seen as a disaster, but rather as an opportunity for both sides to reach a deeper form. Nevertheless, Whitehead says there has been a gradual decay of religious influence throughout modernity. He attributes this to two main causes. The first one is what he calls the undignified retreat of religion in its conflict with science. He says that whenever there is some sort of a sudden shift, for example, with Darwin or earlier with Galileo, this is seen as a victory for science and a defeat for religion. But there is no good reason to view it as a defeat for religion, because of course scientists also, pretty much all of them, adhere to geocentric models of the cosmos. So we wouldn't say that heliocentrism was a huge defeat for the vast majority of scientists. But for some reason, it seems very natural to say that it was a defeat for religion, even though religion also adapted, just like science did. And the second main cause is the propping up of religion by means of either emotional reactions or else non-religious interests. Emotional reactions here refer to what Whitehead calls a instinctive fear of the tyrant, which is basically relied upon to instill a sense of religiosity when all other methods fail, and something that's far too barbaric to serve as a proper foundation for religion, or social order for that matter. Non-religious interests here refer precisely to the maintenance of social order that religion enables. It refers to rules of conduct, are, according to Whitehead, an inevitable byproduct, but not the main point of religion. Now, of course, the maintenance of social order is hardly a trivial achievement. Whitehead doesn't go into much detail on this. So here, the expression byproduct is a bit, perhaps slightly odd, but still, it does seem fairly easy to see why it's hardly the main point of religion. Moving on, perhaps one of the, well, probably my favorite quote from the whole work. So just go ahead and read it. Religion is the vision of something which stands beyond, behind, and within the passing flux of immediate things. Something which is real and yet waiting to be realized. Something which is a remote possibility and yet the greatest of present facts. Something that gives meaning to all that passes and yet eludes apprehension. Something whose possession is the final good and yet is beyond all reach. Something which is the ultimate ideal and the hopeless quest. The immediate reaction of human nature to the religious vision is worship. Religion has emerged into human experience mixed with the crudest fancies of barbaric imagination. Gradually, slowly, steadily, the vision recurs in history under nobler form and with clearer expression. It is the one element in human experience which persistently shows an upward trend. So basically completely inverting the prior picture, rather, in spite of the decay of the influence of religion, religion itself is the one thing that has consistently improved, that has always popped up in nobler form, even if in a form that isn't as influential as the previous ones. And the final quote, something, I think this is also the two sentences with which he wraps up the chapter on religion, if I'm not wrong, is as follows. The worship of God is not a rule of safety. It is an adventure of the spirit, a flight after the unattainable. The death of religion comes with the repression of the high hope of adventure. So both of these, I think, are absolutely beautiful expressions of beautiful ways of putting the answer to the not very simple question of what religion is. He, throughout the chapter, repeatedly stresses that these changes through which religion emerges in nobler form are not to be seen as adulterations, as something which diminishes the eternal truths that religion expresses. Because, of course, insofar as they are eternal truths, those changes, the fact that they are expressed in a way which is compatible with the scientific worldview of the present day is hardly a problem for them. They don't lose anything of their eternal truth. Now, moving on to the second chapter we're looking at here, and also the final chapter of the book, Requisites for Social Progress. He starts off by talking about the general conceptions introduced by modern science and saying that those are, in all the different fields, inseparable from a certain philosophical framework which he associates with Descartes, which, well, has as its foundation the idea that mind and body are independent, substantial existences. The way Whitehead explains this is by saying that Descartes was led to speculate in this way by the current emphasis upon the individual value of his total self. He implicitly transformed this emergent individual value, inherent in the very fact of his own reality, into a private world of passions or modes of independent substance. Also, the independence ascribed to bodily substances carried them away from the realm of values altogether. they degenerated into a mechanism entirely valueless, except as suggestive of an external ingenuity. The heavens had lost the glory of God. So much more so the earth and creation, one could add. And one important consequence of this Cartesian worldview, which of course is, well, Cartesian in a specific sense, it can hardly be described to Descartes in a completely explicit form, is that the notion of completely private worlds of subjectivity also leads to private worlds of morals, that the moral fabric of society is sort of torn up into individual, completely isolated pieces. One way that this can be seen is in professionalization or professionalism in knowledge, which we can also term specialization. Here he says that the celibacy of the medieval learned class had been replaced by a celibacy of the intellect, which is divorced from the concrete contemplation of the complete facts. So basically, experts in their respective fields deal with ever more complex abstractions, and they deal with ever narrower selections of abstractions, and their knowledge of other areas of human existence becomes basically negligible. As the joke goes, one could add, to the point where they know everything about nothing. Now, this, of course, is necessary for science, because science, especially in such a phase of its development, requires people to dedicate quite a bit of time to those very complex and specialized abstractions. But the main problem with this is that the generalized direction of society lacks vision. The problem is not in science itself. The problem is in culture, in sort of the way that culture has been understood throughout history, sort of a common moral fabric with some sort of mutual understanding and moral direction that guides society. But the solution or the counterweight to this is not merely more abstraction. So the way we solve this isn't by having chemists study comparative linguistics. The counterweight has to be somewhere else, but it's also not in sort of a merely practical mode of existence. I quote here, "There is something between the gross specialized values of the mere practical man and the thin specialized values of the mere scholar. Both types have missed something. And if you add together the two sets of values, you do not obtain the missing elements. What is wanted is an appreciation of the infinite variety of vivid values achieved by an organism in its proper environment." In this appreciation of the infinite variety of vivid values achieved by an organism in its proper environment is nothing other than art. And in the context of culture and education, what is crucial here is precisely aesthetic education. And much of this chapter is basically an ode to art. And one really beautiful quote, basically following the formula of Kant's famous dictum on concepts and intuitions. This one: "Sensitiveness without impulse spells decadence, and impulse without sensitiveness spells brutality." Sensitiveness here being understood as basically emotionality, something along the lines of that. And he sees art as precisely a way of achieving this balance in humans, at any rate. Then another thing that he, as we'll soon see, ties back in to the idea of the organism. He talks about two principles in the very nature of things: change and conservation, and how it's impossible to go with just one of those at the expense of the other. And this, of course, can be understood on the individual level or on the social and political level. And in many respects, it could be seen perhaps even as some sort of a foreshadowing of the things that were to come on the continent in the decades following the publication of this work. But now to see how this ties in with the organism, another somewhat longer quote: "The secret of the higher organisms lies in their two grades of permanences. By this means," and this is in the original a bit of a strange formulation, "by this means the freshness of the environment is absorbed into the permanence of the soul. The changing environment is no longer, by reason of its variety, an enemy to the endurance of the organism. the pattern of the higher organism has retreated into the recesses of the individualized activity. It has become a uniform way of dealing with circumstances. And this way is only strengthened by having a proper variety of circumstances to deal with. This fertilization of the soul is the reason for the necessity of art. Here, there's a bit of a parallel with the way that Varela talks about the dialectics of cognition. Of course, Whitehead is here talking about a much higher form of cognition, of course, cognition understood in the Varelian sense, whereas Varela takes something similar to be true for life as such, even for unicellular organisms. So, of course, in the case of human beings, we do have these incredible degrees of variety. But even in the case of an amoeba, it is still subject to the same dialectics of cognition, which sort of demands of it to, on the one hand, maintain its identity, and yet on the other hand, to constantly need to encounter fresh new circumstances in order to survive, in order to preserve its identity. Now, moving back to the social level, Whitehead as a science has prioritized things over values, and the prevailing worldview has done the same. And this has consequences for social organization. Material things and capital become basically the only acceptable goal of society. And another very Instagram-worthy quote: "Ultimate values were excluded. They were politely bowed to and then handed over to the clergy to be kept for Sundays." Really, absolutely, absolutely beautiful. The sort of thing that, I don't know, it's really amazing to see something like this. You know, if something like this happens at a debate, that would probably go viral. You can imagine some MP in the House of Commons saying something like this, that would instantly become viral. Now, to tie this in with the loss of ultimate values, or at least their decaying influence, Whitehead uses two interesting terms: the gospel of force and the gospel of uniformity. When he talks about the gospel of force, or rather argues against it, he understands the gospel of force as a view according to which living beings, and especially humans, are isolated entities in a state of constant war against one another. And against this view, he highlights the mutually interdependent nature of not only humans, but of life as such, of all living beings. He gives the example of a forest before then moving on to the specific case of human beings, saying that what has enabled humanity to achieve what it has achieved is precisely the capacity of human beings to work together, to cooperate, to sacrifice their self-sufficiency, if you will, in order to be able to manipulate the environment. And on the other hand, he also argues against the gospel of uniformity, or rather the idea that all differences between different groups of human beings are to be seen as something to be shunned, something dangerous, something terrible. A quote on this: "Other nations of different habits are not enemies, they are godsends. Men require of their neighbors something sufficiently akin to be understood, something sufficiently different to provoke attention, and something great enough to command admiration." Another thing that is very relevant, especially today, and when ideas of different groups of people sort of take center stage in many discussions. And finally, to wrap this up, the conclusion, I mean, the final few sentences, 3, I believe, or 4, of the chapter and also the book, and a very short ode to reason. I quote: "The moral of the tale is the power of reason, its decisive influence on the life of humanity. The great conquerors, from Alexander to Caesar, and from Caesar to Napoleon, influenced profoundly the lives of subsequent generations. But the total effect of this influence shrinks to insignificance if compared to the entire transformation of human habits and human mentality produced by the long line of men of thought from Thales to the present day, men individually powerless, but ultimately the rulers of the world. So I think that's a perfect point at which to wrap this up and move on to the discussion.
Thanks, Adnan. This was fabulous. That was an extremely well prepared and very eloquent presentation of the last two chapters. Of course, Whitehead helped a bit.
Oh yeah, definitely.
We could probably agree that Matt had a way more difficult job here. But still,
yes.
that was very impressive. Well done.
Thank you.
So yeah, I'll just if anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to jump in.
I'm wondering what everyone thinks about the enduring relevance of his concerns about the course of civilization. You know, this was a century ago, a little less than a century ago. It struck me that in the chapter on religion and science, he was worried at that time about the decay of religion and the rise of science as not only a source of technological advance and changing mentality, but sort of replacing the whole religious worldview and sense of values with something purely secular and scientific. But it seems like 100 years later, the tides have turned a bit. You know, the secularization thesis, so-called, has not really borne out, and religion is rising again, and it doesn't seem to be a more progressive form of religion. So there seems to be some regression, and we seem to be waiting for that more integrated, refined form of religion that Whitehead promises will come. So I'm just curious what you all think about the extent to which what he says remains relevant, or if times have changed.
I just think that at the time this was written, I mean, there are some passages that really seem like they're foreshadowing what happened in the following centuries, decades, of course. And yeah, things that happened, one could definitely make the argument that those things happen when sort of traditional religious institutions become weak, and people have to find something else to consider as transcendent, as eternal, as worth sacrificing their own and indeed the lives of others for. But today, I mean, some aspects of religion do seem much more progressive, comparing some views of Pope Francis, for example, with the views of the Catholic Church 100 years ago. Does seem, just 20 years ago, seems to be quite a bit of a contrast there. But overall, maybe the secularization itself is sort of done something interesting, in the sense that no one is really the main problem that Whitehead seems to be concerned about, and I think he shares it to some extent with Nietzsche, is not the scientific criticism itself, not what David Strauss was in Germany with the historical approach and criticism of the literalist interpretation of the Bible, but rather the change in moral values. And to what extent those two things have to be interrelated is a different question. But the bigger problem definitely seems to be the decay of moral influence, and that one does seem to be quite evident today, probably more so than 100 years ago.
So something I would take issue with is his general characterization that there is a decline in religiosity throughout history. Like there is this linear, we're from the beginning of man, we are slowly becoming less religious. I'm not sure this is really all that accurate, because you've had these increases in religiosity and the declines over and over. For example, even in ancient Greece, you had initially the Homeric period, or even before that, then Hesiod, who was starting to sort of try to bring reason, logos into religious thought, and then the emergence of the Ionian philosophers, which were trying to bring to explain the world in a more science-like way. But then again, things changed. Again, you had polytheism taking the stage, and I feel like this process has been going on for quite a while. I'm not sure, and we are just basically in the ascending part. I think in this demand for more religion. Even I would say even certain representatives of science in the popular fields, like on YouTube, the horsemen of the apocalypse of atheism and so forth. I feel like there's a lot of religious sentiment in the way these movements are being executed. So I think these things are a lot less clear than Whitehead, for example, presents them.
Just, I'd like to check this with Matt. Maybe I'm not sure if I remember correctly, but I think he was referring to modernity when he says that religion has been continuously declining in influence, not to history in its entirety.
No, I think he explicitly says, like, from the beginning of man or something like that. I will be able to find a quote.
He talks about religion fading and then recurring. It's more like the tide comes in and goes out. But yeah, during the modern scientific period, certainly it was low tide.
One thing I would perhaps add here is I think that what Adnan pointed out about the important influence of this secularization thesis is quite correct. I mean, it definitely brought a new way of thinking about certain topics and questions into the game that simply cannot be, you cannot unsee them, so to speak. So the very parameters for any type of religiosity have changed in the sense of how it tries to justify itself. And the thing is that I agree with you, Matt. There doesn't seem to be, at least at this point, and at least not on a global scale or on a larger scale, any convincing way of integrating, say, the newly arising religiosity and the crumbling secular thesis. I have the impression that we're witnessing a transitory period of sorts, and these tend to be most scary, and they can give rise to very brutal phenomena where people have just, not necessarily on an explicit level, but say viscerally or implicitly, they've kind of grown out of the secular thesis. They don't really believe it anymore, but it's so firmly entrenched in our cognitive and emotive and habitual mores that it's just difficult to break out of them. There is still, for instance, there's almost something embarrassing admitting in an intellectual or an academic setting that you're, say, deeply religious. I for instance, remember when I was reading Viktor Frankl, and when he was saying that when he had people come to him on psychotherapy, they didn't have problems talking about their sexuality. They didn't have problems talking about the utmost perversities they were into, but they had severe issues talking about religion, like talking about what their intimate religious beliefs were. And I think this is very telling. It's not, we don't talk about this enough, I think, not only in the sense of just, like a therapeutic sense, but it's not taken seriously in contemplating these questions necessarily. This strange shift that has occurred, we're still, it's always like whenever something is discovered that's been subdued in the past, and then all of a sudden it becomes part of the mainstream, many people just pipe on and on about this. They still pipe on about this. You know, you have to kind of, you're still suppressed about your sexuality. Nobody is just suppressed about your sexuality. I mean, look at internet porn. It's just like, what the heck, you know? It's just, how far can we really get any further from this, aside from killing people literally, you know? And even that. But with regards to religiosity, it's a whole different ball game, I would say. So I think we're living in very schizophrenic times, so to speak, like literally split-minded times, and we don't really know how to bring this together.
I mean, I just like to briefly add that I mean, precisely those changes in views on sexuality are sort of one aspect of secularization that was not really present 100 years ago, and also in Whitehead's time, rather than the time when this book was published, you know, mankind didn't really have that much experience as we have now with what happens when you completely try to get rid of all traditions and customs and, you know, common law, and when you try to replace that with something that is meant to be, you know, some sort of perfect order that's meant to be achieved by force if necessary. Because, you know, okay, of course you had the French Revolution, but that was fairly distant. That was basically like a tiny little experiment. You know, you didn't have what happened in the 20th century. So in that sense, perhaps people in Whitehead's time in the 1920s definitely weren't really aware of what can happen when you just try to get rid of everything. But, you know, not to say that that sort of caused the general current of secularization to flow in the opposite direction afterwards. It definitely didn't, except maybe very, very briefly. And these forms of secularization now, apart from sexuality, if we think about, I don't know, the prevailing scientific sort of scientist view, you know, sort of a radical reductionism, it really can't get any more secularized than that, you know, because then you ran into a whole load of questions about morality, about beauty, about a whole bunch of things that you can no longer ground in any conceivable way.
It does seem like Whitehead, in emphasizing the value of individuality, would have not been surprised by the rise of, you know, the spiritual but not religious people who don't have a church, they don't have a religious community, they're not really keen on dogmas or doctrines. It's more of a spiritual free-for-all, and each individual has their own religion almost. This, you know, he might be critical because of the fragmentation of morality that this implies. But I think, you know, maybe we are in a kind of transitional period here, and this increasing individualization, at least among more New Age crowds, will push through into some new properly religious form in the coming decades. You know, maybe the ecological crisis will foster literally like more of a ground for all of these New Age spiritual beliefs to orient people towards the earth, particularly if the traditional religions are able to move in a more ecological direction, as Pope Francis is exemplifying. But it seems like there are so many different phenomena happening at once now, because in addition to the rise of spirituality, non-denominational spirituality, there's also, especially in the US, I don't know what it's like in Central Europe, but fundamentalist Christianity is as powerful now as it's ever been. Even with the other political party in power, there's still this entrenched political resistance coming from conservative Christianity, which in some odd way allies itself with capitalism. And it's completely irrational. It views science, climate science, public health and medicine as conspiracies by elites to take over. And, you know, I don't want to get into that whole conversation, but there's a total dismissal of science, and it's impossible to reason with people like this. And so there's a rise of fundamentalist religion at the same time that there's this rise of non-denominational spirituality. And so it is really a chaotic moment. It's not really clear what will happen in the coming decades. I've never been so uncertain in my life of what's going to happen even a week from now, much less, 5 or 10 years from now. So, if Whitehead was certainly right about the rate of change, and that, within a generation now, and this was in his discussion about education, people are constantly needing to reskill themselves. And he was aware already 100 years ago of the need to shift our educational forms so that people would be more prepared for the rate of change, whether technological or social. And gosh, it's accelerated 100-fold since his time. Like what I'm only 35, and what kids are into these days and the language that they speak, like I feel very old, and I don't think I'm that old, but
yeah, I mean, regarding conservatism in America, it's something that's always been sort of interesting to me, not just the alliance with capitalism, that's a whole different conversation maybe, but especially with, I don't know, particular ideas argued for or rather funded by, huge corporations, think of the Koch brothers and stuff like that, which are, the problem there, apart from the whole issue of capitalism, is that, there's precisely the sort of huge corporations that stifle any sort of proper capitalist competition or, free market or anything. The alliance with these groups is specifically, interesting in the furthering of sort of really ecological ends. It does seem very strange, but it's not, it's maybe, at least to some extent, a more specifically American phenomenon, because, just if you look at the UK, for example, the British conservatism has always seemed to me to be quite a bit different from that. Taking the example of probably the best known conservative philosopher in Britain, Sir Roger Scruton, he's definitely a conservative and an Anglican, but of course, definitely not a fundamentalist, no matter how you understand the term fundamentalist, but also an author that's incredibly captivated by and focused on the environment and the importance of nature, and everything. And that's for a long time been a very important theme in conservatism in the UK and the continent as well. And also, one thing I remember from a lecture, I don't know which one, in Germany in the 1930s, the reason that, I can't remember his name now, but I think he was the head of the SA. He was later executed in the Night of the Long Knives. I think, I can't remember his name, but, in Nazism, there was sort of this idea of the second revolution, which would sort of take mankind away from technology, technology in Heidegger's sense, for example, back to nature, a very sort of ecological focus. But then that was, of course, overridden by the idea that maybe that's not the best way to achieve world domination. So it's that specific aspect of conservatism is maybe somewhat specific to America. And just very briefly regarding New Age movements and this sort of spirituality, which isn't religiosity, suppose if you're something of a perennialist, it doesn't mean that erodes morality, because there nevertheless has to be some sort of common core of morality as well. Even though the problem is that in many cases it is completely dissociated from morality. You can think of Western forms of Asian spiritual practices, Buddhism, are sometimes to quite a fascinating extent dissociated from the associated moral aspects, which are always central in the traditions themselves. So in that sense, it does carry something of an erosion of morality with it.
I would perhaps add here something, just a minor, maybe a minor point, but it ties in with what Whitehead says in these two chapters, among other things, is namely this lack of vision, lack of vision that would somehow guide societies on a larger scale, that would provide a certain narrative, a certain story. And this is something that is profoundly ethical and aesthetical, I would say. And there is an enormous hunger and thirst for this. And I would say that, for instance, this, to many, surprising rise in the woke ideology, for someone who was watching this from the sides, this was just incredible. The fact how quickly this developed, not only that, but how quickly it developed, but how quickly it was gaining legitimacy way faster than most of other philosophies or ideologies. And people who were at the beginning like chuckling things off either have become completely averse to this, or they have become born again woke people. And it's just, it's incredible to observe this. And I feel that there is a certain hunger to have this framework, and it's a good constellation of many different factors. It provides this feeling of moral guidance. There is a certain morality that is finally being put forward in very clear ways, now in very pernicious ways as well, but clear ways. And it majestically, as most of these most pernicious approaches tend to do, it plays on something that is very noble and very worthwhile, to somehow harbor very angry and angry sentiments. Like there's a lot of resentment and anger and frustration, and they're couched in very, very noble terms. And I think that this is one of the indications of this hunger for a broader vision of sorts, that people are just latching on to different things where they can kind of channel their strong emotions and put them into a certain framework that provides guidance and determination, even though it's conceptually and theoretically naive, even silly. For instance, if we weren't in this particular situation that we are currently in, if we were to read the classics of the identity politics and whatnot, they are like theoretically extremely, extremely weak. Or at least they would be, put up to discussion, and people will see there's a lot of problems with that. But now all these steps are just kind of overtaken. They're just, not really necessary. So I find this very interesting, especially as someone who, well, it's present here as well, but not to the degree that you see it, say, in the States or in the UK. So yeah, that's one thought that popped into my mind. Miha, you had your...
Yeah. I think education was briefly mentioned, and I think when it comes to civilization changing, I guess, moves in, I guess, in philosophy, what Whitehead does here with education, I think, is fascinating. It's something, I guess, he shares with his pragmatist predecessors, right? Just as James, I guess, and Dewey as well, deeply thought of this problem of education. I think it's fascinating, really, because I don't think this is something that a lot of philosophical schools really dug into deeply, really. The problem of education, right? What is it? How do we conceive it philosophically, right? What it is. And it's something Whitehead, as some of you might know or not, right? He develops later on more deeply in his work. What is it?
Aims of education.
Yes, aims of education, exactly. Thank you. And there's one quote which which actually stuck with me the most in this last chapter, and it has to do with, I guess, this, what he calls an upward trend of wandering, right? And he says, one main factor in the upward trend of animal life has been the power of wandering. And then a bit later on, he says, physical wandering is still important, but the greater still is the power of man's spiritual adventures, adventures of thought, adventures of passionate feeling, adventures of aesthetic experience. And I guess this, in combination with how he, I suppose, conceived education in aims of education, where he dissects it into three distinct stages, right? One, the romantic stage, then comes the stage of precision, and then comes a third stage of generalization, which he also understands as a kind of secondary romantic stage, really, but is a stage of where, I guess, principles then are formed, right? And I guess this, well, I guess wandering really, I suppose, and how this, well, I guess we can call it, I guess, a kind of preliminary stage in education. This romantic stage is something that is, I guess, more or less, I guess, forgotten, right? We always want to get to the precision stage first, right? I guess that's how it's, and that's how education was naturally usually conceived of. Yeah, any thoughts on that, anyone?
Adnan, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I mean, not to pass over the theme of wokeness too quickly and to tie this in with Miha's comment. I mean, the sort of sentiment or ideology or way of, I don't know, way of expressing oneself that's become very prevalent now in certain circles is really, the main problem with it is that it precisely inhibits this kind of wandering. You know, if you've got a sort of very strict orthodoxy to which you have to stay committed at all times, or else you're, you know, going to be called some very interesting 20th century names, you can't really wander. You know, you can't really, you lose that spirit of adventure that Whitehead talks about when he talks about religion. You know, today we're going back to the good old practice of public denunciations of oneself and others, especially perniciously when it is oneself. You know, one thing I would definitely give credit to, you know, conservatives like XIII for is precisely the idea. You know, if you get rid of any kind of religious or other value, you know, if you're if the entire source of meaning in your life comes from, you know, I don't know, dating apps and drugs, well, of course, some ideology like that is going to be extremely appealing. You know, of course, you're going to be absolutely thrilled at the prospect of something absolutely collapsing and completely destroying social order, because, you know, you see yourself as not getting anything out of it. Of course, you're not going to think why, you see no reason to preserve any form of social order. You know, you're going to see that as the enemy. So in that sense, yeah, it inhibits this sort of wandering, and especially today in academia, like in certain circles, again, not very much here, and I can't really speak for any other part of the world, but it's everyone is hyper conservative in a strange sense, you know, because as long as you stray from a very, very particular way of looking at things, even a bit, that's it. You know, you're done, in possibly your career as well. So it's incredibly, if anything, maybe one thing that this is pointing out is it's sort of hard to be an eccentric it's hard to be innovative if you haven't got some sort of transcendent value in something other than a how to put it, resentment fueled ideology.
Yeah, that's a good point, Adnan. I would just, what I was thinking before is that precisely, you know, this idea that we're all somehow determined by these factors that are over and above us somehow. So, for instance, you yourself might think that you are not racist and not sexist and so on and so forth, but the truth of the matter is that you're so imbued in these structures that basically you are, even though you think you're not, and the more you deny it, the more racist you are. So there is, I would say, there are two moments here that are, I think, so intriguing and fascinating. So first of all, it's a very different way of looking at things. So there is a certain novelty. This novelty, as you correctly pointed out, is turning so quickly into a new form and a very rigid form of conservatism that it's basically becoming rigid as we speak. But the second point is there is a certain segment of transcendence there. Like all these structures, they are transcendent in a certain sense. So there is this craving, I would say, for something transcendent. And there are these structures that determine you. They're there. There are certain narratives that kind of, you know, stretch from the past, and they're not really clearly defined. They're somehow cultural and historical and political and what have you, but they're just somehow there, and they determine you, yeah, and they transcend you. That's the crucial point. So there is this craving, I would say. This would be false transcendence. Who used this particular term? I forgot. False transcendence or something like that. There's this notion used by someone. Anyway, but this would be a good example of that, a very, very vivid example of that. And it probably ties in with what you've said, Adnan, with the fact that there are no frameworks, there are no structures, there are no. So this is basically kind of emerging in a certain strange aesthetic moral vacuum, and it probably just piles up different things together. So I don't know, several things that I would maybe just ask others here as well. So this idea of Whitehead about the education of the aesthetic education, and say the also maybe something related to this, like moral education, like what would this entail, and is it even possible again to reintroduce value and beauty into the structure of the world? I think it's imperative to do something of this sort, you know, like we've played this game where we've pretended that you can sever things neatly. It doesn't pan out. I mean, whichever way you cut it, you end up with some values. With some values, at least you end up with certain epistemic values that don't have a further justification than aesthetics or what have you. So whichever way you cut it, you end up with certain evaluation, certain polarity that is there. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. Anyway, Matthias.
Did you say you kind of switched off your audio?
Yeah, Matthias.
I'm happy that you brought up aesthetics, and I maybe want to also just ask another question that has been bothering me for some time. When you go through old cities like Vienna or Prague, you can see these layers of culture and cultural production, right? You had these very like what the Germans call Gesamtkunstwerk, right? You have like architecture, you have arts and crafts, you have fashion, you have art, that all is oriented around a certain thing. It has its own vision. You know, you go through Prague, you see the classicist buildings and the art of that time, and there was a fashion connected to it, you know, it was very uniform. It had like one vision and one aesthetics. And then you have Art Nouveau, which was the last movement of that kind, as far as I can see. And it happened exactly before the First World War, right? Like Schiele died. I think he was a war prisoner, and then he died because of the Spanish flu. And he was like one of the last. He already was part of a new movement, right? Expressionism, way darker. Also, he was still very, very aesthetically gifted, I would say. But he already broke away from this overarching vision of, they went back to the Greeks and all of that. Like the music was integrated into it. And now, like since that time, since the cataclysmic events of the First World War, which was the first really technological war, you could say, it's just, it's awful. Art is awful. Architecture is awful. You can really see, especially like the socialist buildings in Prague. You go 3, turns to the right from this beautiful Art Nouveau road, and you're like, oh my God, where am I? What is this? It's depressing to be there, to walk through this street. And yeah, I don't know. I don't see much. I don't see like that too. There's not an overarching vision in aesthetics right now. I feel, at least. And a lot is just very, very cynical. It's very cynical. Like art today is just cynicism, and like making fun of what came before. And in that way, and that, like, it's also part of this woke ideology by just saying, well, Shakespeare is a white man, we don't have to deal with him. It basically says, for me, implicitly, if I would really read someone like Milton or Shakespeare or try to paint like Caravaggio, it would be, I would fail miserably. I could never achieve that level of genius. So I just brush it away because he was, a white man, whatever. We don't have to read him. It's very strange. It's also, so I just wanted to know what you think about these things.
Before we continue with this, Adnan, I think, has raised his hand. I would just like to say one thing, namely, I will unfortunately have to get going because I promised my mom that I will help her with something. So what I would like to say are 2 things. First of all, thank you so much for attending all of this and for all the presentations and marvelous discussions. Matt, thank you especially. I mean, you're an esteemed Whiteheadian scholar, so having you on board was just really a privilege, and thank you for taking the time. And the second thing is that the next author will probably be either Simondon or Plessner, and you are more than welcome to join that discussion/reading group as well. I think it will be extremely interesting. And Matt, you said that you're slightly fed up perhaps with Whitehead. Maybe this is the opportunity to broaden your horizons, maybe engage closely with other authors. Anyway, I'll probably have to get going in approximately several minutes, so I just wanted to use this opportunity to say this. Now we can go back to the discussion. Adnan.
Thanks, Seb. I'd love to join for the next one. So
marvelous.
Yeah.
Thank you, and I also hope that Matt, you will join us for the next one. This has been going on for quite some time. This little reading group, and now it's really becoming sort of transcending itself in a very interesting and fascinating way. Okay, to get back to the topic at hand, what Matthias mentioned, architecture. One way of putting it is that buildings are no longer seen as dwellings, but rather as something sort of consumable, something to be used for some time and then basically thrown away. We've got these inhuman towers of glass and steel and shapes. Or are you going to say that about something that's that can be written or composed in the space of 5 seconds with nothing but a MIDI keyboard and a loop pedal? So those are definitely interesting questions, and it's becoming impossible to even ask them. that's the problem. The problem isn't that, you know, people are making specific aesthetic judgments. So definitely not. That is not the problem. The problem is that you can't really talk about aesthetic judgments anymore. You can't really talk about anything having artistic value in any form at all. Because if you say it and if you imply that that is something more than just your individual subjective opinion that's just as valid as any other, well, sorry, but being oppressive.
I can sort of relate to what you're saying in regards to maybe the USA, but I'm not sure this is the situation in Slovenia.
No.
Yeah.
No, thank heavens.
Yeah.
It isn't.
Good.
Definitely
I
isn't.
haven't had such difficulties discussing, and I have most of my friends who are in different political circles, different parts of the spectrum. They don't have problems discussing art and having the idea of objective beauty or something. It's just that there are different objective beauties in conflict.
Of course, that's the thing. It's definitely not something that's present everywhere, but in sort of the, how to put it, the very woke circles of academia in the US, certain parts of academia, of course, not to generalize, it is the case. But I think that sort of view is definitely finding its way into universities in Europe as well.
Yeah.
And again, this is something I can never stress enough. The problem is not that particular view. The problem is when that becomes something that you basically have to commit to, that you have to hold, or else you're, you know, morally vile. That's the problem.
I would actually add to this that if you want to study so-called fine arts, what you learn is ideologies. If you want to learn how to draw and paint, you have to study illustration, right? And like graphic design and like how to create renders in Blender and other 3D things, you know, for marketing and PR and cinema. But if you want to study fine arts, you just learn ideology. That's it. And like how to poop in a can. I don't know. And cynicism.
Oh yeah.
In most universities, like
I'm not talking about that type of fine art. I wasn't referring to that.
No, I'm just saying that there is definitely, if we would be in the so-called high echelons of art, of the art world in Europe, then what you said is very true, and it's not just in America. You know, I would say that. I mean, there's some counter movements. You know, you have some artists who are trying to actually do beautiful things. But
yeah, I think I have the very persistent but unfortunately anachronistic habit of the fine art to refer to, you know, art that isn't what you're describing, you know, to refer to not necessarily purely classicist art, but, you know, I think you sort of get the basic gist of the way I'm using that term. But of course, unfortunately, I'm probably part of a tiny minority that would use that term that way. It no longer means what we might sort of romantically to mean.
One thing in relation to architecture, which we talked about, is I remember when the infamous Jordan Peterson visited Slovenia, and I think he tweeted some comment about the brutalist architecture at our main square in front of the parliament, and people were up in the air about it. How dare he insult our architecture? And I think it's on one hand, it's symptomatic of this tension of desiring architecture to be something aesthetically more than just slabs of stone, and on the other hand, also a symptom of how personally we experience architecture, how much it is a part of our personal and cultural identity. Like, yes, Slovenes are kind of a significant portion of Slovenes are kind of fond of our previous times in Yugoslavia, and we're emotionally attached to some of these buildings. And it's interesting how really the spirit of a people, the spirit of a time, gets coalesced into stone, and in how much conflict with this we are.
I mean, that's also something that he mentioned when he was when he has his lecture in Slovenia. It's one of the first things he mentioned, I think. But one thing that I really think is sort of very often overlooked deliberately and perniciously is that it's not as if fine art in the way that we're referring to it now. I really didn't want to. I didn't know how to refer to it. I'd say art that's beautiful, but then that would be a bit. I don't want to be too offensive to all types of, experimental art. I don't want to go too far that way, but let's just, for the purposes of this, use fine art in that sense. It's not something that's purely European. It's not an expression of some sort of racism and only valuing, I don't know, ancient Greece, Rome, and then Christian Europe. That's not at all the case. Now, Matthias, for example, I assume that you're fairly familiar with Tibetan art, as I sort of got the impression that you're mainly interested in Vajrayana. Would that correct?
Yeah, I don't think they have great art and architecture, to be honest. But there's this I don't know who said it, but a friend of mine who studied literature, he brought it up a couple of times, and this writer basically said a European or like somebody from the Occident can never really truly understand what Buddhist cultures would think of as beautiful. There's a very fundamental disconnect, and we talked about it quite a lot, also in terms of our fundamental narrative and the Buddhist fundamental narrative. They're quite different, and somehow, I don't know why, but I think great literature really lives from the biblical stories and narratives in there. And you don't have great literature, like great Buddhist literature. It doesn't really, nothing comes to mind, And I read like Japanese authors, but the really good ones, like Shosaku Endo, he was a Christian who wrote Silence and like really marvelous books.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I said, of course, even if you just look at some examples of art in Tibetan Buddhism, you don't have to compare them to the classics of Europe. Compare them to the sort of conceptual art that is all the rage today. Still, I think we'd probably agree that some very delicately built building, or just some mandala that's extremely beautiful, that is much more beautiful than sort of a urinal. That shouldn't be too much of a stretch. And if it's just a urinal, I don't know, maybe there's some value to it if you do it for the first time. Maybe you're making some sort of a point, but by the
he did write on it, this is not art, right? That's what he wrote that on it. This is not art, right?
You're making a point there, but if you do it for the 5 millionth time, after millions of people have done it before you, well, you've got to ask some questions there. And as for art and Buddhist cultures, I'm sort of mainly familiar with different traditions, mainly Chan and Zen in China and Japan, but also I've been fascinated with with early Buddhism, and it does sort of come out of a backdrop of classical Indian Vedic culture, and that's something that's fascinating. I mean, and by extension, some aspects in some aspects of literature in early Buddhism, really draw a lot from that. And to me, of course, I suppose living in the West and everything, these sort of Christian, even in broader terms, Abrahamic motifs are really deeply seated in our way of looking at the world. But the Vedas and that type of, I just find that something absolutely sublime. The richness, the sort of literary richness but also the richness of the worldview that those works depict. And a lot of that is present in early Buddhism. When you still had the Buddhist cosmology, that's a very, very interesting thing when looked at from a literary perspective, but also from a moral perspective. It's really interesting because at the beginning you really have very detailed descriptions, the devas and everything, and the battles, and that sort of old cosmology with the, is it 4 main land masses? I'm not really sure right now, but it's very, very, very rich. Of course, that's probably the aspect that is of all the aspects of Buddhism least present in Zen, but it's nevertheless an interesting. It did leave its mark even in Zen.
I think Vajrayana has a very interesting aesthetic, but it's very internal. It doesn't really like external. It's very garish and a lot of colors, and I think the really beautiful aspect of the mandala is what you cultivate internally, and to the point of the old Indian cultures, if you travel in southern India, especially, and you go to these old temples, they're very sublime. It's incredible, but they're also very, very alien. It really looks like as if you're dropped on another planet. The statues there with all these arms, and it's so strange. Doesn't look human, really. That was one thing that impressed me the most. No, it's beautiful, but in a very odd way. It's really like cosmic strangeness.
Yeah, I mean, I think I had a tiny inkling of how different it is. I had a course in Sanskrit here by a professor that we basically spent most of his career as professor of linguistics, in writing about Sanskrit and also other the Iranian branch of languages. And the way he would talk about it, sometimes we'd be talking about one particular hymn in the Vedas, and one time, like, he devoted a lot of time to a single verse, and specifically a single word, how looking at where it comes from, and how incredibly fitting it is, because it's not a correct Sanskrit word, it's sort of a Prakritism, but then there's a reason why it is like that. It sort of gave me a bit of a window, okay, so you basically just have to spend like 20 years digging into it and really learning Sanskrit, Vedic Sanskrit, to just sort of get a grip on it. But still, there is something it's definitely more foreign than the Greek epics, definitely. But
they're pretty foreign too.
There are some aspects.
Reading Homer now, it's like, whoa, no. What is going on there? That is. Really...
But in some respects, if you look at the Odyssey, like isn't that sort of the motif of Western civilization? Going out on a quest, return, facing injustice and everything. It's quite a motif of our sort of individualist Western society, even though it's very, very, very ancient.
Yeah, I also had a similar experience that Homer feels surprisingly current. Like it doesn't read to me. I read it like recently, and this year during the quarantine because I had too much time, and it very much felt related to this civilization, to this experience we have as a Western people. Even the Iliad, maybe the Iliad doesn't feel like it's our immediate surroundings, but it feels like a kind of a remembrance of when there was still a kind of order, when there were gods ruling the world, and this is a world which we have in a way fallen out of, into the individualism, into the chaos of the Odyssey, where we are lost in this uncertainty of fallen idols, looking for our way. And yeah, I think it read surprisingly currently. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
I was reading Iliad a little bit, and I found it's it's very different the way it is written. It has a lot of this orality to it, right? Like all the formulaic structures, what is it, you know, one person is always the brave one is always the smart one. I read it in German, so I don't know. I think like Orpheus, the clever Orpheus, right? Always comes the same thing, and when somebody dies, it's always the same. Either the spear goes through the mouth and out on the backside, or they cut open the belly and the guts spill out. It's very graphic, but it's always the same. It's like this weird, like, because it still comes from an oral tradition, and you have that very much in the Buddhist and Vedic old literature as well. It has a lot of, you know, like numbers, 5 of those, and they are repeated again and again because it was thought of as being more spoken than read. And if I compare that to modern literature, it's very, very different. Like the feel of it, the structure of it.
Is it compared to the most
yeah.
modern literature? Like
no. Like
in the avant-garde, for example, you had
Dostoevsky. Let's say if you compare Iliad to Dostoevsky,
maybe not the most comparable. But for example, in the avant-garde, when people were trying to find new forms, when people were playing with sounds, with the orality of poetry once again, and even today, for example, slam poetry, which is an interesting phenomenon, where people are actually using similar techniques to Homer, to all the bards which Homer was synthesizing, actually.
Yeah, like the hip hop, what is it, like the battles, right? They also have certain formulas ready to use that they use. So that circumstance. So yeah, it's reoccurring. It's coming back also with internet culture and all of that, for sure. But I think the bigger bulk of what we are reading, let's say, when you read like a book of literature, is a little bit different than that, I guess. You know. Anyway.
Just say that I think that's more due to the actual medium, the fact that it was originally an oral work, because like it's not that epics are something that completely disappeared after antiquity. Now, for example, I grew up in Bosnia, and in that language, which, you know, one beautiful representation of the sort of political complexities of the region is that, you know, just saying the name of the language is, you know, it's Bosnian Croatian, Serbian, Montenegrin, Serbo-Croatian, whatever you call it. There's a very rich history of oral epic poems.
Yeah, the bards, the Serbic bards, right? Yeah.
And even if you look at one of those,
in Tibet, you still have it. You have the Lingesar bards that are still producing the epic and new chapters of the epic today. Actually.
No, okay, there you don't really have new chapters that much, but even if you look at something that was still very much current, a sort of a current living work of art, just, you know, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, it's incredibly foreign. I'd say it's just as foreign as the Odyssey. I'd really say that it's just as foreign. Of course, apart from the significantly less pronounced differences in culture, that's a different thing, you know, specific theology and everything. But other than that, the way they're composed, is incredibly foreign. So I think it's more due to the medium, the fact that, you know, epic poetry does have to be conveyed in such a way that's really, really sort of hard to compare with written works. And, you know, even Homer, like, sort of, I've always had the impression that you get a much better feeling of that by reading it out loud, or not necessarily out loud, you know, just really focusing also on the auditory character of the voice in your head, you know, not reading it in the same way that you read Dostoevsky, or reading it in some sense similarly to poetry. So it definitely does. I think it's medium.
Or how we use books, because this is also, you know, like we were also in oral culture for the longest of times till Gutenberg, more like, and after Gutenberg it really changed, that people read silently and with their eyes more than with their mouth.
I remember who has a beautiful essay on that. Maybe it's Pierre Ador. He sort of, I think he talks about that, but the change in the culture of reading, you know, because before, I don't know exactly, but let's say the 17th century, reading was not at all something that you do in your room, or in your study by yourself with a book in complete silence. That was completely foreign. It didn't exist. It's interesting to think in what way the invention of that form of reading also changed the way we think, because there doubtless was or had to have been an influence. It's sort of a, Heidegger makes similar points, sort of a retreat into a different form of understanding. He would say the beings, but the relationship between subject and object, sort of a very Cartesian, isolated, very Cartesian picture of isolated subjectivities.
I think Primož, you wanted to say something. I had the feeling.
Yeah, I think I sort of forgot now. Yeah, I think I wanted to suggest that for perhaps comparing the Iliad to fantasy novels. And I think that's an interesting comparison to make. You also have in fantasy very clear archetypes, and often with very, very, very title-like names to characters, the swift-footed, or even like you have in the simpler kinds of fantasies. There's usually names which mean some precise thing, and there's a formulaic story in a way, and there's all these fantastic elements. And I think in both fantasy novels and in the Iliad, in the way the Iliad was conceived throughout the ages, it was a kind of return to what was before, to a kind of tradition, to an order which predated our current condition, where the Odyssey expresses where we are right now, lost, stranded. The Iliad is always this retrospective look, and I think you have a similar thing in fantasy, which is unsurprisingly usually placed in the past, in history, usually medieval fantasy. Sometimes it's placed in the future, but when the future is so far ahead that it's basically no longer really connected with our present. For example, in Star Wars, you have in a galaxy far, far away. I don't remember the rest of the title precisely right now, but you have the sentiment of retrospection. And I think this is similar to the Iliad, and I think that's a fruitful comparison to make, and trying to understand the Iliad in a more modern fashion. This is all very much to do with Whitehead, right? Somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best discussions are very often the ones where, we stray quite a bit from the text itself. This, I mean, especially was couple of chapters that really, really open the door to, talking about pretty much anything. Sort of like browsing Wikipedia. You start reading about the Ottoman Empire, and you click 2 times, and you suddenly you're reading. You're
talking
about,
Homer and
cancer,
fantasy literature.
And definitely more than other chapters. When we were talking about the chapter on abstraction, I mean, good luck finding something that's very obviously relatable to that.
Let's not talk about that chapter.
We need a while to process it, I believe.
One topic that I did want to bring up during this discussion is this idea, which Whitehead, I think, sort of tries to present here, that religion progresses, that it's developing towards something. And I'm wondering what you think about it. Is religion really progressing? Is that in sync with what religion is supposed to be? For example, Plessner would say that the whole point of religion is that it presents a static point. It doesn't change. The same thing, the same Bible, which held value 2,000 years ago, I don't know what the exact dates, is also in a certain sense, maybe not in such a literal sense, but definitely in a metaphorical sense, holds as much value as it did back then. And to this end, I wonder, really, is religion developing in a profound, deep way, or is it going somewhere? And is this vision of his for religion to cooperate with science and sort of build on top of each other, is this really feasible or even desirable? I don't know if this topic inspired any of you.
I'm thinking about this a lot because I'm in this Buddhist modernist world, right? I work for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, one person removed, but I work for his representative here in Austria. And His Holiness, I think, was he saw what is happening, right? And he said, we have to sit down and we have to talk all of this over with the scientists, what we are doing, to get any sort of credibility, because otherwise Tibetan Buddhism will just vanish. The Chinese will destroy it. And if it is to survive in the West and in Western culture in some form or another, it has to be in this dialogue. And on one hand, this was very, very important that he did it, I think, but it opened a whole can of worms, right? And one big can of worms is for sure this idea that you can take out certain parts and make them non-religious, like mindfulness practice, watching the breath, that is something non-religious. It's hard. It's really hard to argue this when you go deeper into the tradition, It's like, not so sure. To your point about religions transforming or developing, I think there's always this tension within the tradition itself to, like when I start talking about a work by Shantideva, like his Bodhisattva Avatara, whatever, like some big work. If I start talking about it, on one hand, I have to be sort of steeped in the tradition. I can't really go on incredible tangents. You can't like move very far away from the text. You have to explain what is in the text, right? But so there's always this going back to the tradition, to the lineage, which gives you the authenticity of what you're saying, right? So you get molded by these ideas, and you have to speak these ideas as they are presented. You cannot just completely flip them on their head and be super innovative, and like do your own thing with the Bodhisattva Avatar. That's like, yeah, is it still Buddhism? Probably not. But at the same time, it has to still be relevant here and now, right? So it has to be a dialogue with what is, with the cultural moment, with people of this time. So there is this tension, and I think this tension always exists. I don't know if you can call this developing, though. I'm not sure,
Mm-hmm.
There I would be, because it's also, I think it's linked to the tradition itself is important. It's one of the important aspects of religion, that you have like a core set of what this is about and what you're doing and where you're going, and like there's all these parts in the different traditions that tell you, do it like this, because otherwise you're on the wrong path. You go astray and create problems and go, lower rebirths to hell, blah, blah, blah. And I don't think they would be very happy in general to rewrite all of that, just to fit the moment, the present moment. So,
just a quick comment. When you say that it's there's always this coming back to the tradition, even if you look at one of the many possible etymologies of religion, religare, it means to rebind, to reconnect in a way. So yeah.
Yeah. Or yoga, like Neljor, means also to connect, yoke, right?
I'd say that of course, mostly familiar with a different strain of Buddhism that has been very prominent in the whole postmodernist movement. Obviously, but yeah, I'm also very critical of some attempts to make things there non-religious, and I think in Zen it's even more pronounced. Sort of somewhat equally, I'd say, in Zen and in Vajrayana. But some traditions have fortunately evaded that issue to some extent. Like Theravadins were pretty, just going to stick to the whole lot of it, and that's it. Which is, quite a simple and definitely one way of dealing with that problem. But we don't have to go that far. Even if we look at the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, I think that there is some sense in the idea that religion is, well, developing. Let's use that word in a very, very general sense, non-teleological sense, because a religion
It's transforming.
has to be, yeah, transforming. That's much better. Thank you. Religion has to be, the basic texts have to be somewhat ambiguous. Maybe that's not the best expression, ambiguous, but broad. They have to be applicable, broadly applicable. You know, if they can be applicable to different cultures in antiquity, you know, to Jews and as well as to Gentiles across the Near East, the Middle East, well, then it's not a surprise that there's going to be a way to make them applicable today. Same thing can be said for Buddhism. They do have to transform to some extent. You know, so Buddhism transformed quite a bit when it came to China, for example. You know, with the Theravadins basically sticking to all of the Vinaya, the precepts, and you know, the Mahayana basically going a somewhat different road, especially in China. You know, with completely different customs, completely different culture. Going along with those practices in early Buddhism would have been very hard, and probably would have been impossible for Buddhism to catch on that much in China. But here also in the West, I'd say that religious texts sort of have to have a very broad meaning. And when you read the most things in the New Testament, like they're perfectly compatible with the early Christian theology. Like, you know, hell is literally down there, heaven is up there, and you know, the world is about to end. And they're also perfectly compatible with a modern worldview, provided that you interpret them in a different way, because they don't say, texts don't say, you know, literally hell is down here. And also they're not really, the point of those texts is not to do the business of science. The point of those texts is not to describe objectively how, you know, scientifically, how the world came to be, and you know, those questions, which, you know, one thing I really find fascinating about Buddhism is that it doesn't really concern itself with that much. You know, how was the world created and stuff like that. That's not the point. The point is precisely the sort of moral value in those texts, and even those stories. Again, Buddhism has plenty of them, of the devas and their adventures and wars. They're not really meant to be taken as literal descriptions of events out there in the world, but they are mainly understood through their moral character, through what they say. And of course, it's also possible to, rebirth is a different thing. Rebirth is something that would be, I think we could discuss that at much more length. It's a subject that I find so fascinating, and so I really don't have a very strong opinion on that whole debate and how to understand that today. But overall, I do think that we can say that religion can be transformed through changes in the prevailing worldview. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. I think in many cases it's necessary. The problem is when that transformation also takes away from its moral values. And in that sense, it is extremely important to stick to the original texts and stick to, you know, not to just rewrite it, because you can't do that. I mean, of course, you can't just you know, on a whim rewrite a text that's that foundational and that old. Of course, it's incredibly important to stick to it, but I do think it is possible within a different worldview. So the meeting is about to end. I think I will have to go now.
Yeah, we can restart once again, I guess, and have one more round, and then it'll be, yeah, I guess we can also
I'm
end.
very tired. Actually,
yeah, I guess we can just
I had a long day.
call it a night. And see you in the next reading group, I think.
Yeah.
Yes, Plessner, no? Plessner.
Yeah, I shall
time in
fight for
English.
that.
Probably.
Oh my God.
No, in German.
No, I want to go through. Yeah, let's do it in German.
Yeah.
Die Stufen des Organischen.
Yeah, totally. Okay, then.
We used to discuss English texts in Slovene, so
Yeah.
German texts in English. Always, you know, pick whatever translation you want.
So I guess
or not
we'll
a translation.
stay